here at the London Business School Africa Business Summit, and I'm chatting to Bob Diamond, the CEO of Atlas Merchant Capital and founder of the organization. Thank you very much for joining us, Bob. Let's talk about Africa and the opportunities that you see on the continent, which many say is rising. Others say we're hitting a stalling environment and we are headed into a period of very subdued growth.
Well, I think the title of my panel today that you and I will both be on is about headwinds. And clearly there are headwinds. The commodity cycle, more volatility, big change in prices. For those countries relying on extractive industries, it's had a big impact. I think a perceived pullback of China in terms of investments really across the piece impacts Africa as well. One that isn't talked a lot about is the impact of the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 in investments in places like Africa. And if you look at things like trade finance, almost 50% of the trade finance in sub-Saharan Africa prior to the financial crisis was supplied by European banks. Today it's almost zero. It's really been stark. So one of the things that gets us excited in building a bank across Africa in Atlas Mara is the opportunity to drive lending to African consumers and African businesses, because we do believe in Africa rising. And if we do believe in Africa rising, there has to be investment in a robust and well-funded financial services industry.
The commodity headwinds. What are your thoughts on how this is going to pan out?
So, medium to long term, this is pretty positive for Africa in many ways. If you look at President Nyusi in Mozambique, if you look at President Buhari in Nigeria, if you look at their agenda, it's really driven to diversify the economies away from what has been a reliance on the extractive industries. That can be pretty positive. If you look at the potential for the agricultural sector, for example, in Nigeria, it's the largest sector of that economy today. It's already larger than the oil industry. In the short term, there are real challenges in terms of slower economic growth, in terms of currency valuations. We see that with a medium to long-term bullish look at Africa and the opportunities in Africa because of demographics, because of urbanization, because of technology, all the things that we've talked about. We're still very, very positive. This is a great time to be investing because the prices of businesses, in our case of banks, is lower. And the currency levels versus the dollar or other major currencies are also at a good level. So we see this as a time to invest.
Let's come back to your space and the opportunity in the financial sector on the African continent, given the fact that mobile banking has helped the continent to leapfrog. I use that term that is widely used when it comes to financial inclusion. Is there still broad-based opportunity in the financial sector?
Oh, and in so many ways, Bronwyn. If you think about the impact of technology, not just in financial services, but really across Africa, it starts with the mobile phone. It starts, to use your term, the ability to leapfrog. A very large percentage of the population in sub-Saharan Africa, well over 70%, have never been in a bank branch. If you begin your banking experience on a mobile phone, you're typically going to rely on it a lot more than if you grew up in a branch-based banking system. But it's also about the cloud. Our chairman at Atlas Mara, Arnold Ekpe, formerly was the chief executive at Ecobank. And he told me about the time when they invested in Francophone West Africa, 8 countries, and they built a data center. And the data center investment was $25 to $50 million. This was 10 or 15 years ago. Today, to provide that kind of infrastructure with cloud-based technology might be $1 million or maybe $1.5 million. So the cost to operate financial services companies is dramatically different. And then third, the impact of big data and the ability for Africa companies and African financial services companies to accelerate their lending to small businesses is enhanced if they can access information and data about
With the
those
technology
companies.
underpin, specifically the mobile phone, are banking models having to converge with telecommunications models across the continent?
We're seeing some of that, certainly, but I still believe that the regulated banking industry, and when you think about the impact that the financial services industry in sub-Saharan Africa can have on business, and I really like to think about business. If we can crack getting lending to African businesses, particularly small businesses and SMEs, by drawing on the successes that we've had in other areas of the world around capital markets platforms, around specialized lending units to agricultural or to women in banking, and really fashion lending around these industries and small businesses, we can make a dramatic impact.
What is the key to access to finance for small businesses? And you mention women and farmers. We know that large areas across the African continent are driven by agriculture. How do we make this finance accessible? Because what you're talking about now is transformative. It's the focus here at the London Business School Africa Business Summit. How do we empower our entrepreneurs, small businesses?
This is, I would say, probably at the very, very core of why my partner Ashish Takar and I began building Atlas Mara just over 2 years ago. Since the financial crisis, we've seen many of the Europeans pull back, particularly those that were providing trade finance. We've seen Barclays make an announcement because of the regulatory charges to exit Africa. We've seen one of the other South African banks recently talk about separating the businesses. The Chinese are very, very involved. The Chinese banks are very involved, but they're typically following their customers, not building bricks and mortar. We don't see global banks coming into Africa. So if we're going to get lending to small businesses, it's going to come through the banks that we're building on the ground in Africa. One of the challenges in many of the countries is that the business model is reliant on taking deposits and investing in treasury bills. And if you think about, many of the countries have local currency T-bills at 12, 13, 14, 15%. There isn't a strong incentive to take risk to lend to businesses. So what do we do about that? One of the things is we create organizations like Atlas Mara that says openly we're going to be positively disruptive and get lending to small businesses, get lending to businesses. To do that, we have to bring in techniques that have been used in other markets, such as how do we get specialized lending units for agriculture? How can we help farmers hedge their crops out 2 and 3 years so they can be more certain of the income, and then we feel better about the credit? But we also need the development agencies, the DFIs. We also need the treasuries of these countries to understand that there's a role for them to play too. Maybe it's in a credit guarantee, maybe it's in a 10% first loss. In other words, many of these development agencies can help encourage the banks to get lending to small businesses that might not have the credit to stand by the bank standards on their own.
Your passion for small businesses is tangible.
Yes.
I don't want to take us off track, but you did mention Barclays Africa, so this is probably the appropriate point to deal with that question. It's in the public domain that Atlas Merchant Capital and the Carlyle Group have put together a consortium to bid for Barclays Africa assets, or a portion of Barclays Africa assets, and that the Atlas Mara board has endorsed that decision, the strategy. Any comment?
No. And as you know, I'm here at the London Business School Conference on Business in Africa to really talk about Africa.
Let's get back to Africa. Which do you deem to be the most exciting sectors? We've chatted about agriculture. We know that agriculture needs to transform from purely subsistence into a value-add supply chain and start creating proper businesses for those involved in the agricultural sector, including women. What other sectors excite you?
Well, agriculture is probably right at the very, very top. Over half of the unfarmed arable land in the world is in sub-Saharan Africa, and we're just beginning to get sophistication in the financial services industry so that we can get lending into the agricultural sector. I think many people are surprised to find out, that in Nigeria, the single biggest portion of the economy is the agricultural sector, not the energy sector. Specialized lending units for women is something that is high on our agenda and very exciting. Specialized lending units for small businesses in general across sectors. I think.
What about the hotspots on the African continent? Rwanda is touted as the jewel in the crown right now. And it's very much open for business. Côte d'Ivoire, I'm not sure if you've been to that territory recently, but seems to be embarking on a lot of the same policies that Rwanda is instituting. You can open a business in Côte d'Ivoire for 24 hours. They're also huge on the beneficiation theme, #1 producer of cocoa. So I'm excited about different territories. Which territories are you excited about?
And I do think Rwanda deserves a comment. I think in the last decade, it was one of the world's top 10 growth markets in terms of GMP, and it's expected to be in the next decade. And I think their focus on education, their focus on women, their focus on making a business environment that's very positive. We've acquired 2 banks in Rwanda. We're now combining those 2. And we're also doing all of our mobile phone technology investment from Kigali, and that will roll out to our banks across sub-Saharan Africa. So what President Kagame's done in terms of making an environment conducive to business people wanting to be there and wanting to work, and conducive for the private sector, has been fantastic. But it's not just Rwanda. And I think what we're seeing more and more of is a cooperation across the trading blocs in the East African community.
So that regionalization theme is real.
It's real. And so what we're seeing there with the president of Rwanda, the president of Uganda, the president of Kenya, working on ways to break down trade barriers, break down transportation barriers, make it easier for workers to get across border. You know, only 11% of trade in Africa is inter-Africa. If you take North Africa out, it gets to about 20%. But that still pales in comparison to what it should be. 50, 60, or 70% of trade in Africa should be amongst the sub-Saharan Africa countries.
I mean, Africa could insulate itself from global shocks if it just started trading with one another.
And this is fixable. And so we're seeing the trade blocs and the very, very strong leadership that's coming from many of these countries begin to break that down. The SADC region, we're seeing the same kind of thing. So I think a focus on trade, focus on business, focus on cross-border business is incredibly important to keep the momentum in the economy. And now more than ever, with the headwinds that we're facing from commodities from China and from some of the international banks pulling out.
You mentioned a couple of different African countries there, mostly in East Africa. You say it's not all just about Rwanda. Anything else that stands out, and this is the final question, from a country perspective that you're excited about? Is there anything in West Africa?
Well, we just love the opportunity in Nigeria. You know, we've just had the first peaceful transition of power in the history of Nigeria. There are challenges because the biggest source, the majority of the foreign currency reserves in Nigeria came from the energy business, and certainly we've seen
so this
a sharp
foreign exchange
decline.
crisis in Nigeria is not going to scare you off?
No. We love 70% of the people that live in Nigeria are under 30. There are more babies born every year in Nigeria than there are in all of Europe. The demographics, urbanization, technology, those 3 big thrusts are very much a part of it.
Bob, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
I've been chatting to Bob Diamond, who's the CEO of Atlas Merchant Capital and founder here at the London Business School Africa Business Summit.